Yes, I'll be talking basically, I guess, from the Japan side. So Ben from Kyoto, and this image here is from Kyushu, a little bit further away. Now, I just wanted to start. I imagine at least some have a bit of an overview of energy policy or an understanding of energy policy and how it is approached in Japan. Japan approaches energy policy much like everywhere else, except perhaps that the energy security issue is particularly dire, if you like. So if we look at the energy policy, basically Japan follows the four pillars of the 3E+S, being economic growth, or economic efficiency, and energy security and environmental protection. Environmental protection generally is taken to be reduction of CO2 emissions, and of course safety, which has been highlighted particularly in the post-Fukushima accident era. And so, as I mentioned, energy security in particular is quite important. One of the sort of the typical indicators of energy security, of course, is basically the amount of energy which is domestically produced, and for Japan, that is generally pretty low. In the East Japan disaster era, and when nuclear power was much freer in its use, then Japan, with nuclear power being counted as being a domestic source of energy, Japan had up to close to about 20% of its energy, well, domestically sourced, with much of that being from nuclear. After the Fukushima Daiichi accident, then of course nuclear power was basically shut down, and while waiting to be restarted with greater safety measures. And so we had a dramatic drop in the energy self-sufficiency, which was followed by a bit of a renewable boom on the back of the introduction of a feed-in tariff by the government, among other measures. And eventually, in more recent years, we've had the return of nuclear power, bringing it back to about 15% of energy self-sufficiency. You can see down the bottom here, just as a little bit on the different forms of energy, typically the fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and gas. There has been a bit of coal produced in the country, which has declined rapidly since the 1990s. Basically, the most coal production has been shut domestically, and apart from that, there is a bit of gas, which I think is mostly associated with refining. Now, energy security in Japan, just to have a brief outline of the history. In the post-war period, basically all that was being extracted and used was coal and hydro. But in the post-war period, that was pretty much making it a very high level of energy self-sufficiency. From the 1960s or late 50s onwards, Japan had a rapid growth based on very cheap international oil, which ended around or at least the dream of perpetual and cheap oil ended around the 1970s with the oil shocks, which particularly heavily impacted Japan because of its reliance on oil, not just for transportation, but for power generation. We also had, so then that really sparked a diversification of energy supply, and so diversification of where Japan was getting energy from, even within the Middle East, basically diversifying as much as possible. as well as an expansion of nuclear, which was also pushed by the US. And we also got the import of LNG started. Well, the first sort of LNG ships in the mid 1960s, and so nuclear and basically then nuclear, as well as some coal, as well as this natural gas, basically started to take up a larger share, making more domestic supply. But again, with nuclear, around about the time of 2011, when we had the nuclear accident, then just prior to that, there were aims of taking the nuclear generation up to about 50% of total electricity mix, but that accident sort of curbed those ideas. In the post 2011 era, a lot of the energy slack has been taken up by natural gas, as well as a bit of an expansion of coal. Just again to highlight nuclear power specifically, so these are the nuclear power, well, the reactors across Japan in various states as they were at the end of March 2011. There were, I think, around about 50, there were more than 50 plants, some of them under construction. And if we look at the moment, there are now 10 plants operating. About 18 reactors have been shut down permanently, and there are others that are waiting restart. Now, Japan is still, of course, currently dependent heavily on imports, particularly because of the decline in nuclear power. As you can see, it did decline to about zero over a few years. But has been gradually making its way back up to around about 5% of total energy supply. At the same time, again, natural gas has grown to take up a lot of that slack. Oil has declined somewhat, and renewables, again, on the back of the feed-in tariff, have actually grown quite rapidly, particularly, as you can see on the right-hand side here. Solar in particular has really grown dramatically within the electricity generation sector. Now, natural gas, again, one of the things which is quite important to note, of course, given the current situation, is that natural gas is around about 20% of the energy mix of the country, which may not seem so much, but within electricity generation, it's around about 40% of the electricity mix, which is up from about 30% in 2010. So again, about 10% of 10% increase to take up some of what is not being produced by nuclear power. And fossil fuels, if you add them all up, are about 85 to 90% of the energy mixer, and all of that fundamentally is imported. So again, when we think about energy security, it's often expressed as these 4 A's of availability, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. So affordability of energy, of course, is one of the things which is quite difficult at this point in time, given the Ukraine war, and of course both Ukraine's position in the production of energy, but also, of course, the various restrictions against Russia. So this year in particular, of course, has seen a rapid rise in the cost of fossil fuel globally, and in Japan, this has been partly mitigated by long-term contracts, which it has for LNG and for coal. But electricity and gas prices are currently higher than the peak that they were at during the nuclear shutdown, which is not too long ago, and they're the highest since at least about 1986. Also, of course, energy is used in the production of other goods and the transport of those goods around the country, and therefore there is a flow on to other goods. And we have just ended a very hot week of here in Japan. On Saturday, it was over 40 degrees in many places and very humid. It's now pouring rain. So the CPI for Japan, if for non-fuel, non-energy products, you can see there, as well as the overall CPI. You can note that the difference here, which basically is affected by the fact that energy prices have quite rapidly increased over since the beginning of this year. So again, this is the input prices versus the prices of energy. So affordability is suffering currently, and that's despite the fact that we have got an increase in the amount of renewables which has come into the mix. Anyway, we'll move on from that. So in terms of energy security, again, energy security is obviously an important point. If you don't have energy, then yeah, well, nothing gets done. But Japan also, again, has this commitment to reducing emissions, and in particular, it has set a net zero emissions target for 2050, which has been just set in the last 6 months or so. So part of this is a reduction of emissions from energy by 45 to 50% by 2030. However, Japan, and that you can see the targeted electricity source mixes here for 2030, noting that basically you have a very dramatic increase expected in renewables, a return to about 20% nuclear, and also have in here hydrogen or ammonia. Now, we can see, so basically that Japan's energy strategy for the future, both in terms of reducing its emissions as well as energy security, is quite highly or quite tightly bound into this idea of using hydrogen. Currently, the idea is to, at least at the beginning, import hydrogen produced in Brunei and in Australia. Ultimately to move to renewables, and of course to use some CCS, carbon capture and storage, and again, nuclear returning. Now, this is some work that we recently did, which will have, has a little bit of well, it does have some relevance to this. But when we're looking at this idea of energy transitions, which is related to this idea of, well, reducing emissions down to zero by 2050. So we surveyed people across the country as part of a project, which I'll mention at the end, which is associated with the British Academy. But the people were asked about what should be the priority in energy transitions, and so basically they came up with well, maybe some of the things which would be expected, but adopting cleaner technology, ensuring stable supply, and you can see that the ones that are labeled in red here are the energy security, the ones that are most related to energy security. So ensuring stable supply of energy, almost 2/3 of people think that that's, well, almost 60% of people think that that's the high, well, a very high priority. Reducing dependency on fossil fuels, and also reducing import of energy resources. We also at the same time asked people what they would be willing to do to help the zero carbon transition. And so things that people would be willing to do are basically to buy pieces of technology. So installing PV and driving fuel cell vehicles, or potentially increasing renewable energy in their energy plans. So what we, of course, generally see is that people are willing to do this, but don't necessarily achieve that. We did a similar survey after in about 2014, which found that most people who tried to do these things, which or who wanted to do these things, which cost a lot of money, ended up not doing it, around about 4% achievement or something like that. But also we asked people what local or national actions they would be happy to accept. And so in order to achieve this zero carbon transition, there wasn't that much support for nuclear power in their town or in their state, their prefecture. They were reasonably happy with PV and wind, and not necessarily so happy about closing fossil fuel power stations either. So I'm not quite sure how they expect to achieve a zero carbon transition. A bit more favour than, well, shutting down these fossil fuel power stations was at least having CCS. But basically, again, PV and wind were being the big ones, which they would be locally happy to achieve or to have done. So a bit of a NIMBY situation. The ongoing situation, of course, will in Ukraine will affect the future. It's not the worst. If we look at oil and gas prices as an index to the prices imported to Japan, we can see they're not quite the worst they ever have been, at least in terms of the oil import price. But with Russia retaking or taking control of the Sakhalin project, could lead to even more price increases. So what does this mean? I guess is if we think about this situation, it's putting a variety of pressures. Economically, of course, there are some pressures which are making things very difficult for all consumers, both business and household consumers. But it also offers an incentive for, of course, for energy efficiency and for infrastructure investment. Over this last week, which has been very hot, there've been a lot of encouragement from the government through the media to basically try and save energy and save money. Here at the university, we also get asked to save energy and save money. The nuclear restarts, of course, with these type of price pressures, we would expect that the nuclear restarts are likely to be brought forward as long as the safety issues are addressed. So there are a number of plants which have been accepted for restart but have not yet restarted. So we expect that perhaps those might be brought forward, which of course will help to reduce the climate change emissions. But again, there is always a voice. There has always been a voice of opposition to nuclear power here. Hydrogen imports and renewables are likely to remain a high priority. Again, all the government's expected plans include them, and those are perhaps just given an even bigger incentive because of these oil and gas prices. So I will finish up there. Again, I just wanted to mention that we put out a report recently about just transitions to zero carbon energy in Japan, which doesn't necessarily address energy security so much, but certainly related issues. So I will finish there.
Oh, there we are. So,
Okay.
Right. It's quite interesting because Ben is an energy expert and I'm a politician, and we're going to see the difference now. But I'm also fascinated by energy, obviously, as a green politician. But I've come at this proposal or the issue for this webinar from exactly the opposite end. So I think that's, kind of intriguing. But I hope we'll meet in the middle, and then that should, I hope, generate some interesting questions. So obviously, what's happening in Ukraine is a human tragedy. And it's really shocking for people in Europe that there's war again in our continent. And it's really changed everything about the way we think about foreign policy, as well as energy policy and defense policy. So I think we need to start by recognizing, you know, the really shocking situation and the tragic loss of life. But I would say it's also very much a failure of foreign policy in the European continent and indeed across the world. And it's also interesting from the point of view of what economists sometimes call the resource curse, which is this idea that countries that have extraordinarily rich resources often actually don't have such peaceful lives. You know, that they're subject to other people's envy and greed, and I think we can see that playing out actually in the situation between Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, they're two very wealthy countries, not necessarily in financial terms, but in terms of resources. And as a green economist, I always focus on resources rather than cash. So we know in the case of Russia, it's very rich in terms of fossil fuels, gas and oil. And of course, in the case of Ukraine, we're increasingly discovering how wealthy it is in terms of the production of absolutely fundamental foods, particularly grains and oils. And so the war is really bringing our attention to the fact that not only do we not have energy security, we also, at least in the UK, don't have food security. I'd be interested to hear some reflections about how that works in the Japanese context. Anyway, I've been quite encouraged because I obviously, as a green, always travel by train, and I'm always looking out of the window and seeing what crops the farmers are growing. And it strikes me that both in the UK and in France, farmers are planting grains. So we're seeing a lot more planting of wheat, rye and oats, and hopefully that will help to deal with at least the food crisis that's already on us and will probably be exacerbated in the autumn. But aside from that, I just wanted to stress very strongly that we have misplayed this situation with Ukraine from a foreign policy point of view. And this very much relates to policy on energy, particularly in the case of the EU member states. So I'm not taking a solely UK perspective here. Perhaps as a former MEP, you would expect me to take a perspective that brings in the European context more widely. And so I think I can understand very clearly why President Merkel took this approach of encouraging peace through trade. That was a policy which Germany wanted to achieve. You know, they didn't want they wanted to move beyond the Cold War in Europe, and they wanted to bring Russia kind of into the tent, as it were, as an honest broker and as a partner. And that's why they allowed themselves to become extremely dependent, dangerously dependent really, on Russian fossil fuels. And of course, that goes for other countries, Baltic countries, Finland, to an even greater extent. But this policy was ultimately misguided, and I think policymakers across Europe really misread the signs. In the UK's case, I think it was even more disreputable policy we followed, which was essentially giving a comfortable home to Russian oligarchs because they were bringing so much money into London and indeed to the Conservative Party, which is our governing party. So in our case, I don't think there was even the excuse of seeking to build peace. It was just very much a self-interested decision. Oh, come on, there. So, you know, we've experienced a decade really where we've turned a blind eye to what Putin was doing. And I think that's strongly contributed to the fact that we've ended up in this appalling situation of war. Now, I was elected to the European Parliament in 2014, and as an economist, I hadn't focused a great deal on foreign policy, but I was now called upon to vote on issues that were absolutely key to the situation that's developed between Russia and Ukraine. And it really didn't take me very long to assess what was going on and to understand that Putin was an aggressor and that we had to deal with him in that way from a foreign policy point of view. The first clear example of that was the annexation of Crimea, which has now effectively become part of Russian territory. But we also saw then in 2016, the absolute abominations in Syria. We can see a picture here from Aleppo, but exactly what's playing out now in those cities in eastern Ukraine was prefigured by the Russian war Russian support for the Syrian government. And what's so important about this is that there was no attempt to stick to the internationally accepted standards, and war crimes were widely committed: attacks on civilian population, destruction of civilian infrastructure, as you can see here. And yet we turned a blind eye to that. We simply ignored what was going on. And in the case of me as an MEP, I've got a picture here of Dawn Sturgis, because this is the example that touched me most personally, because 4 of my constituents, people I represented in the European Parliament, were attacked with chemical weapons, with nerve agents, by agents sent by Putin into the part of the UK that I represent. It's a horrifying and shocking fact. And this is Dawn Sturgis, who was the person amongst those 4 who actually died as a result of that poisoning. And even after this, there was no attempt to introduce sanctions. Diplomats were recalled, but effectively the economic relationship with Russia continued the same, in terms of imports of gas into the EU, in terms of cash flowing into what is called the London Grad, the financial centre in the city. And I think what we were doing then was signaling very clearly that we weren't going to act. And it's not surprising that Putin drew that lesson. And had we signaled much more clearly that we would indeed act and we would not accept this behavior, then we would not, I believe, have ended up in this war. Now, the links between this foreign policy failure and the war in Ukraine, I think, are now obvious. Our addiction to fossil fuels left us dependent on Putin, and it gave him the confidence to defy NATO. Of course, we've also been directly funding his kleptocratic regime and his war in Ukraine. Every month, we send €1 billion from across Europe as a whole to Russia in exchange for fossil fuels. And that money that's still flowing in and has been flowing in over the past decade, is what has funded the Russian army and enabled Russia to build up its war machine that's now murdering and killing people and destroying the infrastructure of Ukraine. So I've put in a couple of slides here just in response to Ben, to show you the sort of comparisons with how we get hold of our energy in the UK. This is overall energy, so this includes transport. The electricity graph is a little bit more encouraging, but when it comes to transport, you can see we're still heavily dependent on oil. So, massive dependence on private cars rather than public transport, and that is represented here in terms of diesel and petrol. The gas is, as we'll see on the next slide, largely used for the generation of electricity. So effectively what we've done since the Kyoto Agreement is remove coal, which you can see in grey, and replace it with gas. We'll see that even more strikingly on the next slide. But the development of renewables is also really encouraging. And the UK is actually a renewable energy powerhouse. So I live in the southwest of England, and in the UK, we have a hat that we wear when it rains. It rains all the time. And that hat is called a sou'wester. And that's because the winds that bring the rain come into my part of the world and blow across the southwest and drop their rain, usually on my head, actually. But that wind is obviously also now an amazing source of energy, and we are beginning to exploit it. We're exploiting it more successfully on the East Coast, and now there are plans to develop offshore wind on the West Coast. For political reasons, we haven't developed onshore wind as much as we could, but essentially the UK is sitting there in the Atlantic with fantastic resources, particularly wind resources, but also solar. Apparently the incidence of the sun hitting the Earth's surface is really promising. You may not think the sun shines a lot here, but I don't think that's really the point. Ben can tell us more. So just moving on to electricity, you can see the really extraordinary changes that we've seen, again, more or less since the Kyoto Protocol, in the energy sources we use to generate our electricity. We also have some controversy over nuclear, but it's contributing a significant amount of our energy mix at the moment. Gas expanded, but is now to some extent declining. But you can see wind, solar, and other renewables are really increasing rapidly, and they are predicted to increase even further. And coal is almost entirely squeezed out of our electricity mix. So you won't be surprised to hear that the Greens, politically, both in the UK and more widely in Europe, are using this war in Ukraine to draw attention to the fact that we are not achieving energy security and developing renewables as rapidly as we could. And there's a very close connection there. And so independence from Russian oil and gas is very closely linked to our development across Europe of renewable sources of electricity generation. And that's what this graphic here is intended to show. So making ourselves independent of Russian energy as rapidly as possible gives us another incentive, if we needed one, to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels from our economies. Simon Evans of Carbon Brief, a UK-based research outfit, has calculated that there are actually 649 onshore wind and solar projects in the UK that already have planning permission, meaning they could be built rapidly. And if they all went ahead, they would save more gas than we currently import from Russia. And obviously in the UK, we don't actually import a large amount of Russian fossil fuels, but the German government, as you know, also now includes Greens. And the Greens that negotiated the coalition agreement were very focused on the energy transition, way ahead of the war in Ukraine, actually. And what they actually now have the foreign minister in Germany. And the other thing they negotiated for was a super ministry in the treasury, in the finance ministry, to oversee a rapid green transition. And the war in Ukraine has significantly boosted what was agreed in the coalition deal in terms of shifting away from fossil fuels and developing renewables. So this is a graph showing the revised package of renewable capacity, which was announced last month, and it doubles the target for renewable energy from 40% to 80% of the electricity generation mix. That's an incredibly ambitious target. And that's it's the first time that renewables have been explicitly acknowledged as being a public security requirement. The country's Renewable Energy Sources Act also includes a goal for offshore wind energy to reach at least 30 gigawatts by 2030, which is the equivalent of 10 nuclear plants, and at least 70 gigawatts by 2045. Now, I was talking just now about the UK's role as an energy powerhouse, and we are currently exporting electricity through these interconnectors, and this is something which is, you can see here, they're in the process of being installed, and that's because renewables need to be shared in a way that actually isn't so essential with other forms of energy, because obviously they're much less consistent. So when we are generating a lot of wind energy, it might not be possible in other European countries, and vice versa. So these interconnectors are a way of sharing energy across Europe. And in spite of Brexit, which you can imagine I strongly oppose and still oppose, geography really dictates that our closest relationships will always be with our European partners, and that's especially true in the case of energy. It's completely wrong. It feels immoral to say we should use the Ukraine war for anything of benefit, but at the same time, it is a spur to accelerate climate action. I'm not showing you this video. I'm just showing you that Antonio Guterres of the United Nations has said so clearly that we are not addressing the climate crisis as rapidly as we need to. We have this tiny window now to avoid the worst effects of climate emergency, and we're just not stepping up fast enough to achieve what we need to achieve. As he says, we hear a lot of promises from world leaders, but effectively it's a litany of broken promises. The European Green Deal, I would say, is ambitious, and it has indeed been boosted by the Ukraine war. Things in the UK are not so promising. The government last month also launched what they called an energy strategy. I really beg to differ. There was nothing for people who were struggling with their fuel bills. There was nothing in terms of home insulation, which is the most important action we should be taking, as I'll discuss in a minute. They're still blocking onshore wind farms because Tory backbenchers, Tory MPs, political representatives consider that they spoil the view, and they've suggested £120 million to support nuclear power, but that's nothing like enough. I mean, you need at least 1 billion for nuclear power stations, and so effectively they're leaving a great big hole in the middle of our electricity supply for 2030 and onwards. Meanwhile, by contrast, in Germany, the super ministry is working now on legislation to raise the energy efficiency requirement of buildings, as well as the ambitious renewable energy targets that I showed you. And they're also introducing other measures that reduce energy demand. So, for example, a €9 flat rate public transport fare. If any of you, some of you are in the UK, so you know the crazy expense of traveling by public transport, not to measure the very poor provision, but that's obviously an easy way to address the cost of living crisis, as well as reducing energy demand. But for me, the most exciting part of what's happening in Germany is that Germany is still a major manufacturing country. So their transition is going to be something that can lead the world in terms of how energy intensive industries can shift their dependence away from fossil fuels for their energy use. And we're going to be watching, I hope, as Germany leads Europe into the green economy of the future here. I feel like I'm running out of time, so I won't explain to you too much about my heat pump, but just to say, I personally installed a heat pump recently, obviously insulated my home first. And yeah, it was actually switched on the day Putin went into Ukraine. And so I think it's really important in terms of this message of isolating Putin and insulating homes. In French, these two are the same word, so it works particularly well. But I think in English, the message is also very clear. And it's really extraordinary that we hear so much about where we're going to get the energy from, and we hear so little about the need for reducing demand for energy. That's absolutely top of the list in terms of energy security. So, yes, I think also this attempt to improve our energy security is about changing the way we live. So warmer homes means lower bills, better public transport, stronger communities, traveling less far, hopefully to work, but also having what we call 15-minute neighborhoods. So you can buy everything you need, have all your services met within walking distance of your home. Again, improving your health, but also reducing your need for energy. And of course, it's always important, the slogan we like, the cheapest energy bill is the one you don't have to pay because your home is so well insulated. So I just wanted to finish by returning to my theme of the horrors of war and the requirement for peace. This is what happens in the European Parliament when we first installed, and it's a group of young people playing Ode to Joy. And you probably know the Latin phrase, if you want peace, prepare for war. And I replace that with, if you want peace, prepare for peace. And to prepare for peace, we have to ensure a reduction in energy demand, a shift away from fossil fuels, and urgent action to address the climate emergency. And I find this a hopeful note to conclude on, because tackling the climate crisis makes cooperation inevitable, and it's closely aligned to the need to resist authoritarian power for those who are challenging the rule of law and democratic standards, not just in Moscow, but also in Riyadh and in Caracas and in lots of other capitals, in Tehran. You know, that's the point about the resource curse. Fossil fuels supplies of fossil fuels do not tend to go along with democratic regimes. And I think what's happening in the world right now, in Ukraine, in Hungary, in France, in our own country, is a challenge to the peaceful rules-based order that we've all enjoyed through our lives. And we're seeing that very clearly now through energy policy and through the need to address the climate crisis. And I'm really interested to hear more about the Japanese perspective, because we need to cooperate as countries that respect the rule of law and use the international institutions, both the G7 and the UN, to actively build peace and democracy and to have those values at the heart of our energy policy. Energy has provoked wars and created the climate crisis, but a cooperative energy policy could build strong links and help us to work together to eliminate fossil fuels. Thank you.